So welcome everyone to today's event, which is about social impact investment. My name is Chris Deeran and I'm Director of Reform Scotland. Could I just ask anyone who isn't on the panel to mute themselves, please, so that there's no background noise? That would be very helpful. I suppose I've been interested in social impact investment for a few years now, since I worked at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University, where there's a whole unit focused on this subject, staffed with some very clever people and with a global focus. And it was always something that just appealed to me in theory, even if I wasn't entirely aware of what was happening in practice. But I know that they've helped seed a lot of different projects and tried to make the case for this as a methodology for moving forward. I think one of the reasons I like it is that it's always struck me as an idea that is really full of potential, that is democratically and fiscally healthy. It seems to be outcomes rather than process based, and I suppose it's something that draws in practitioners with an interest in making a difference in specific and some quite challenging policy areas, and also people in the private sector who are drawn to make a difference, sometimes at a national level, but sometimes in their own communities as well. We at Reform Scotland released a report on the subject a few months ago, working with the team at the Growth Partnership, and this looked at a project in Perthshire called Living Balance, which used the model to tackle youth unemployment and other malaises that were affecting youth in that area. And the paper also made a case for the wider deployment of social impact investment in Scotland. I suppose in short and simple terms, the version of social impact investment that we looked at was something like private investors providing the funds for the project, the delivery team then carrying it out, and then when certain targets were achieved, the public sector would pay back the investors with a small profit. And so I like the way that the incentives line up, that the risk is borne by investors rather than the taxpayer. And I suppose also crucially that it allows for a certain freedom to adjust and innovate on the part of those delivering the project, rather than everything being run with an iron rod from the centre, which can sometimes be the case with public services. There's much more to social impact investment than this, and I know we have people on the call today who have come at it from different angles, and I do hope we'll hear from you to enlarge our understanding. But I am pleased that it seems to be becoming an increasingly popular way of doing things in countries across the world. So we'll hear a lot more about it over the next hour, and we have a great panel with us today to discuss the topic, so you're a very lucky audience. First we have Jill Mcgrath, who is a social entrepreneur who managed the Living Balance project that I mentioned, and she's going to talk us through how she went about that. We have Ian Marr, Chief Executive of the Growth Partnership, which delivers social impact investment services to communities and which enabled the Living Balance project. We have Alistair Davis, who is Chief Executive of Social Investment Scotland, which provides investment for social enterprises. We have Kate Forbes, as you saw, the Secretary for Finance and the Economy, who will hopefully be able to tell us where the Scottish Government stands on all this, also interested in their own thoughts as a bit of a policy wonk. And lastly, joining us soonish should be Murdo Fraser, the Scottish Conservatives COVID recovery spokesperson, who will give us the view, I guess, from the other side of the chamber. So if you have questions or statements, because I think this is one of those things we'd like to hear from you, not just about what you'd like to ask, but your own views, and especially if you've been involved in this model, please do get in touch by using the chat woggle on your Zoom screen. And if you send me an idea of what it is you'd like to ask, talk about, then we'll try and ensure that the best points get to our panel before we're finished. So I'd like to start with you, Jill, and I thought you might take us through the Living Balance project and initially why social impact investment seemed the right path to go down.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for the grand title of entrepreneur. I'm sure that was given by Ian Marr. I'm the CEO of YMCA Tayside, and we had the privilege of successfully delivering a programme, Living Balance, using social investment model in between 2012 and 2015. And this was externally evaluated, which was funded through Scottish Government at the time. So who were the partners? We, YMCA Tayside, were the delivery partner, one of 10 projects across the UK, and we were the only one in Scotland. We had an intermediary who all communication went through and who were the holder of the finance. And then our outcome partner was DWP, Department for Works and Pensions, financed through something at the time, the Innovation Fund. And the funding was 100% payment on results basis, which was completely new to us. And without this model, we would not have been able to go for a project like this because we wouldn't have had the cash flow. So without the investment, that wouldn't have been feasible. And in the end, we had 13 different investors, which I assure you was not our plan at the time. We thought we would get an investor from a grant giver, but it was a fairly new concept and the timescales were fairly tight. So that didn't happen in the end. So we went out in search of investors. And we had at the beginning a secured amount of 150,000, and within a couple of days that had risen to 300,000, which was really quite remarkable. And I think that was what was unique to us with this model of investment. It was local people who were interested in our work that trusted the YMCA in Tayside. It was local businesses who were interested in supporting young people. And it also had a local church that came on board and invested £50,000, which was what we required. So we got up to our 300,000, which allowed us to proceed. Some of these investors also offered their time, coming in to run workshops with participants, offering work experience and employment. And only this week I was asking after a young man who gained employment with an investor 6 years ago and is still doing well, somebody that before Living Balance wasn't able to come out of his bedroom. So who were our participants? They were disadvantaged young people aged 14 to 24. Struggling to achieve in school and probably really struggling to achieve with your traditional 13-week employability programme, which did just not work for them. In fact, I believe that these programmes do more harm than good for young people with multiple barriers. 47% of these young people had 3 or more risk factors and 28% had 4 or more. To give you an idea of the risk factors that were set by DWP: lack of qualifications, potentially leaving school with no qualifications, lack of aspiration, alcohol, drug issues, mental health issues, criminal records, homelessness, or involved in the care system. So that we understood and they were confident that we were reaching the right category of young person. What did the programme look like? It was tailored to the individual. There's maybe some key things that were offered to all participants, and they were what we already did: personal development programmes, one-to-one support with youth workers, gaining qualifications. For lots of the young people, it was the first time that they had gained a qualification. Participation in our social enterprises. So the funding allowed us to set aside an amount per year over the 3-year period to invest in our social enterprises, and 3 are still working well and successful to this day. Much more hands-on for young people that wanted some practical work. They were great. And then residential outdoor adventures, again, for lots of the young people, it was the first time that they'd experienced canoeing or canyoning or just wilderness. And then very important, the employment support for both young people and the employer, which came right at the end, rather than a young person going into a programme to write a CV when they have no confidence, no qualifications and no experience. That would really knock them, which is what we wanted to address. We could journey with the young people at their pace, addressing their needs using a youth work approach, and building those trusted relationships. So quickly, what were our key outcomes? 77% achieved 1 or more of the prescribed fundable outcomes set by DWP. 58% successfully achieved qualification. 56% gained entry into employment, and 61% successfully sustained that employment. Thankfully, all our investors received their money back plus interest because they were local people. And in some cases, the investors hadn't wanted their interest back. And for those that did, they often would use it to set up other good programs and support other initiatives. So for me, on reflection, 6 years after Living Balance, that's why I've got notes, because it's quite a wee time away. What were the benefits for a small charity? So as I've said, we were able to tender for a big programme like this that was on results, and we couldn't have done that without the investment. The continuity of money, so we had a set amount that came to us every month, was just an absolute relief and allowed us to concentrate on delivery and the young people, rather than that constant, for anyone in the third sector here, that constant pressure of trying to find funding. Funding set aside, as I've said, to enhance our social enterprises was brilliant and has made a difference to what we do now. Our relationship with the investors is different if we were just going for a grant. Many still regular givers or supporters in all sorts of different ways. We run a charity ball most years, and it's full of the investors that are really keen to hear the stories from our young people. Ultimately, seeing the transition in the lives of young people, many who had been professionally supported by mental health teams, by youth justice, by social work for many years, that no longer required that support. This is what far stood out for YMCA Tayside.
Thanks, Jill. And in terms of the data that you just told us about, very impressive. Was there any comparison you were able to make how that matched up to other programs that may have not used your model, or what how do you?
I don't have them to hand. Ian will probably know. We kind of compared them at the time with the work programme. And what was frustrating is that if a young person had been registered with work programme, they couldn't come on to Living Balance, but we obviously we still supported them. We just wouldn't be able to achieve an outcome. And whilst you talk, I can look, unless Ian knows offhand what those statistics were, but I remember showing off about them.
Right, that suggests they did well then. That's
yeah.
Good. And you said that having gone through this process, a number of your investors, maybe a majority of them, were keen to do something like this again and found it a positive experience. Absolutely.
I still get contact from investors. You know, we send newsletters out to them, just telling them about the work and case studies. But we'd get regularly asked, you know, every month an investor will say, when's this happening again? And I think when it was such a success, I naively thought that we would be having another programme running quite quickly afterwards, so kept all the investors kind of to hand. And you know, it finished in 2015, so it's going to need to take, you know, some bold initiative just to go for it. But it totally worked for us as a small charity. It was a great success.
Just finally, before I move on to Ian and Alistair, what did your investors say to you about why they were involved and what they were taking from it? Because obviously they're investing money that they might have invested in more profit-driven projects. They knew they would get some money back, although, as you said, a number of them said, don't give me the interest or reinvest or whatever. So what was the impression you got from them as to what their motivation was?
And they obviously knew the risk was to them. So it wasn't from government. There was no risk to government. It was the risk of them not getting their money back if we didn't achieve, was them losing their money. They were just, they gave to other charities. So they were individuals that I think one of them said, you know, they could have made more money if they'd gone for a big, you know, company in the States. A few names were mentioned, but actually what appealed was that it was local. They wanted to support young people. They saw there was a need, and there was a real satisfaction and fulfillment in them knowing that that's where their money was going. And maybe there was more of a connection. So I know that for some of the projects, you know, we were the only one in Scotland, but some of the other projects had a big bank as their investor, and there was not a lot of connection. Whereas our investors were keen to hear the stories. They you know, they love to get their newsletter and support. And as I say, they're still supporting. We're just about to launch a big new youth project that's under construction, and our investors are all buying bricks at the moment to support that fundraising effort. So we've now got a relationship with them.
Well, those enduring relationships sound as valuable as anything. Well, Ian and Alistair, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more in general about the social investment sector, maybe the potential that it has and the kind of areas that you would see it working in beyond the Living Balance project. I don't know which one of you would want to go first. Ian, maybe you, because you were involved in Living Balance. You could give us a broader view of social impact investment and what its place might be in our economy.
Yeah, sure, Chris. So I just told you a little bit about who I am and what I do, so we'll just get into it. Social impact investment changes lives. I think that's the first key thing to say about it. We heard some examples of that from Jill and knowing Jill over the years. I know some of the young people involved. It changes lives, and it does that for the families, the individuals, and the communities in which they live and work. And it does that in the real world, bearing in mind the real circumstances. In Scotland right now, we're coming out of a pandemic, and there's a lot of talk about building back better. There's the National Strategy for Economic Transformation, which the Scottish Government have established a group of people to write a new 10-year strategy for Scotland's economic transformation. And that's key. It's not just a recovery. Recovery is important, but it's about transformation. And I'll come back to that. But transformation will need new tools. We can't expect to address the difficulties and the issues that we have to face using the old tools that we've used for years. That's like saying we can maintain our future fleet of hydrogen and electronic cars using the same toolbox that we've used on the internal combustion for the last 100 years. That's not going to work. We need new tools. And social impact investment is one of those tools that brings together the skills and experience and capacity across the public, private and social sectors, bringing those things together to invest, and particularly to invest in prevention. Prevention is better than it's just better than cure. I mean, everybody knows that. It's better to support families than to see their children taken into care. It's better to stop young people having to sleep on the streets than it is to address the issues that arise from having to sleep rough. Christie Commission was very much about that 10 years on now, but talking about the value of prevention. And social impact investment allows us to do that because the outcome of that prevention, the proof that it's worked, is there and it happens before payment is made by government. And that makes it much easier to make the case to make that investment because you know you've got the outcome before you make the payment. If it doesn't work, government don't pay. Right? The investors lose out, as Jill highlighted earlier. And that gives government two things. I think it gives them a clear line of sight between spend and outcome, connecting spend to outcome, which is always important in public use public money. And it gives them 100% guarantee of the impact of their spend because they only spend what works. If it doesn't work, they don't pay. So prevention is critical to that economic transformation, and social impact investment allows us to do that, to get services on the ground quickly to address the real needs. And coming out of the pandemic, there were real needs there before, but the pandemic has exacerbated those, probably made it more challenging for a lot of individuals and communities and families. And given those real needs, we need to pull together. I noticed the Accounts Commission and Audit Scotland produced a report just a few weeks ago on community empowerment, and they were talking about taking the learning from the pandemic, the experience of the pandemic, and making sure that's continued to be applied in communities. That coming together of communities across the public, private and social sectors to serve with a common purpose, to address issues in the community, and particularly around prevention, and to create real value out of that prevention, real financial value, because preventative spend means we don't have to fix things that shouldn't have been broken. If we invest in prevention, we don't have to fix the things that shouldn't be broken. And an example of that, how that releases real money, in the report that we did with Reform Scotland, the example we used there was the tragic issue of youth suicide. And it's a harsh around a service educated around homelessness and youth homelessness. And it's just a reality that approximately 45% of young people who are homeless will have at least one suicide attempt. Now, the cost, just the financial cost of that suicide attempt to the state is, broadly speaking, £75,000 for every non-fatal suicide attempt in terms of impact on the use of health services and emergency services and so on. Now, the service that we give an example of in the report, the host home service, if that service were to go ahead, if 45% of the young people that achieve all the outcomes, just the ones that achieve the outcomes, if 45% of them that don't have a non-fatal suicide attempt, then that would generate real value in financial terms of 19 million. And that 19 million could be used to spend on education or on creating social housing. The cost of creating one social housing unit in Scotland, an average social housing unit, is £150,000. I haven't actually done the maths, but I'm sure there's quite a few 150,000 in that 19 million. You could build a lot of houses with that. So, social impact investment, it changes lives, it saves lives. It draws on the skills across the public, private, social sector, brings all those together with a common purpose. It allows you to invest in prevention. It provides a 100% guarantee of government spending because you only pay if it works. It creates services on the ground quickly. There are investors out there who want to invest. Jill was talking about the fact that she's constantly being asked, when are we going to do this again? And I know Alistair will talk a little in a moment about other investors, and I know from talking to the economic division of the Scottish Government that they're having contact in the context of, right in the inset, the strategy of economic transformation, that they're having contact from investors saying, look, we have money, we want to invest in society and social issues. So there are investors out there, there are delivery organisations out there, like YMCA Tayside, and others who want to use this structure and this tool. The models we've developed, there are delivery organisations already committed to delivering those if they can be achieved. Yeah. So if we bring together all of that commitment from all of those parties across the public, private and social sector, with commitment from government in the way that we did in the pandemic, though, then I think we can create that economic transformation. We can bring transformational systemic change to how we deliver services in our communities, particularly to some of the most vulnerable members of those communities.
Okay, thank you.
I thought to discuss it with you.
Yeah, okay. Alistair, Ian makes a good point there. I wonder if I could challenge you on whether, when we talk about the word transformational, this model has the scope to scale up to be truly transformational, or whether it will always be a tiny part of things the government are trying to do, or things society's trying to do. I mean, you're working, I guess, with investors as well, Alistair. So what's the scope of it that you see, knowing from the financial side of things where the potential is, and how much we could rely on this kind of model to really make a difference in society?
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. And perhaps I'll come on just to provide my perspective on that question after setting my response in context in terms of who Social Investment Scotland are and our perspective on the overall social investment marketplace in Scotland. So it is good to be here. This is something that Ian and I have been discussing for many years since Living Balance was coming to a conclusion about how we might continue to embed some of the learning of that project in Scotland and perhaps beyond. But for those of you that are not familiar with SIS and our work, we were established back in 2001 by the Scottish Government. So the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that means that this year we celebrate our 20th anniversary as an organisation. And alongside that milestone, we also recognise the achievement of now having made over £100 million of investments to over 450 organisations right across Scotland, which means that we are the largest social investor in Scotland, and indeed one of the largest anywhere in the UK. And we are ambitious for the social investment sector and indeed the wider social enterprise sector within Scotland. We believe that it's got a significant role to play, and this model would be part of that. Indeed, our vision as an organisation is for an impact economy, what we call an impact economy, and that's one where social and or environmental impact is a factor in every decision that is made as part of an economic ecosystem. And more often than not, that's involved in ensuring that enterprises and entrepreneurs have access to investment that recognises and indeed supports and encourages the achievement of social and/or environmental impact. But actually, there are other factors at play in terms of what we believe an impact economy is. And other features of an impact economy, we believe, are allowing governments the opportunity to partner with social enterprises to embed the achievement of increased social impact, and also to provide investors with the opportunity to make investments that create both a social and an environmental return alongside more conventional financial returns. So this model, we believe, is one such way in which that might be possible. And indeed, we would endorse the key policy recommendation from the Reform Scotland report that this is something, a model that is worthy of further exploration on a pilot basis initially. Our experience would suggest the market is ready for an expansion of this model. But I want to make three particular recommendations and also respond to your question, Chris. You've heard from Ian and Jill about the different constituent parts that are required to make this model a success, and one of those is indeed the availability of the investment capital that can provide the risk capital that's essential to make the model work. Over the 20 years that SIS has been in existence, we have experience of raising investment from a whole variety of different social investors, including the Scottish Government, including trusts and foundations, and individual investors. Recent research suggests that the size of the social impact investment marketplace is increasing. In fact, at the end of 2020, it was estimated to be worth some £6.4 billion, which was a 20% increase on the year before, and a market that was considered to have increased in times by 8 times since 2011. Now, we have seen a similar growth and trajectory at Social Investment Scotland, and we would consider that there is an opportunity within that social investment marketplace to provide the risk capital that this model needs to make it a success. Secondly, we've also heard from Jill in terms of an organisation that relies on having the expertise and the networks to make it work. But I think we also have to recognise that when it comes to social investment, there still remains to be a considerable amount of nervousness when it comes to funding models that organisations might not naturally be familiar with from past experience. Now, we do benefit from a very comprehensive social enterprise strategy in Scotland, a 10-year strategy, which is the envy of many other nations. But I think there does need to be a recognition within any expansion of this model that some support will be required for organisations that want to engage in models like this to support them with the scale and capacity that might be required to make it a success. And my third and final one is a broader point which relates to some of the observations that are made, particularly at the start of the report, relating to the need for a response to the pandemic and the work of the Council for Economic Transformation. And I would suggest that, and certainly it is the view of SIS, that if we truly believe in economic transformation and the opportunities of a well-being economy, then I would argue that charities, social enterprises, and indeed the broader third sector deserve to have a seat at that table. And our response to the work of the Commission highlighted a number of examples of social enterprises that had the potential to scale to increase their social, environmental, but also importantly, their economic impact. And indeed, this model is another way in which I believe that the third sector can make a really valuable contribution to economic transformation as we respond to the challenges of the COVID pandemic.
Okay, thanks for that, Alistair. And you're confident that that social investment can play a significant role in economic transformation coming out of COVID, and maybe moving into a new way of looking at the economy. As Ian said, the old tools are not necessarily all that we have to use going into this. It's not just a small, a sort of good-hearted thing to do that we're doing because it's good-hearted rather than because it actually has a significant role to play.
Of course, I mean, I could point to numerous examples of social enterprises that were in existence at the moment and were emerging on the back of the pandemic, that were making not only a valuable local or national social impact, but making a real economic impact to the local and national economy by creating jobs, and often creating jobs and local impact in some of our most challenging communities, or for individuals that perhaps might experience challenges in accessing the labour market, as you've heard from what was the experience in Perth. So no, I don't believe that this is a sideshow. I believe that there are real and meaningful opportunities. I would have said that before the pandemic, but what COVID has highlighted and perhaps exposed is the real opportunity that social enterprises present to make a real difference to economic transformation in Scotland.
And we've heard about youth unemployment, homelessness has been mentioned. What are the other areas that you see as being ripe for this kind of approach?
I think the two that have been highlighted are very relevant. We've been talking for some time about particularly the innovations that have happened recently in relation to housing and homelessness, and how that was perhaps an environment where there could be further innovation in terms of the models that could be used in terms of service delivery. I know there's one highlighted in particular in your report, but I would honestly say there are probably no limits in terms of where we could explore how this model could be applied, providing the various different actors that are involved in the equation are engaged and supportive of it. And certainly we stand ready to support the various different parts of that model to see how it could be a success.
Okay, thanks, Alistair. Kate Forbes, I know you've got your budget coming up, so I'm sure your entry and your diary are absolutely stowed. So we're really grateful for you giving us an hour today. As I said earlier, I know you're a bit of a policy wonk as well, so I'm interested in your take on social investment. I'm sure it's piqued your curiosity because you are curious, but where are you on this as a model and as a possible route for the Scottish Government?
Thanks so much, Chris, and great to hear the previous speakers. I think the point that Ian made, which others have repeated, is that if you do the same thing, you'll get the same outcome. So if you agree that the outcomes need to change, you jolly well better try and do it differently. And that for me is the starting point in all of this. I have two particular interests, two particular objectives. One is that we deliver effective public services. In other words, they actually achieve the aim that they set out to achieve, rather than just keeping people in business. And secondly, that our finances are sustainable. So that's where my interest comes from. So if there is a new model that's more effective and is more sustainable, then I think it's worthy of very careful consideration. I think the four areas where I basically got two sides of the coin here. Four areas where I think there's potential in this model to be effective, and four areas where I think Scottish politics fundamentally and the public sector fundamentally have to change if it's going to be effective. Because always the question is, of course, if something is too good to be true, you ask yourself, well, why hasn't it been rolled out prior to this? And I think that's the other side of the coin. So, you know, anything that's outcome based is in and of itself more effective, I think, than the way that we do things. I know how much money we spend, let's say, on employability initiatives, £1 billion on top of other interventions. Now, my question would be, at a time where there is a real shortage of labour, is that £1 billion actually solving a problem? I also know how challenging our child poverty targets are. So my question are those interventions actually giving parents, for example, a route into the labour market and reducing the amount of children in poverty? So the first question, anything that starts with outcomes, I think is absolutely brilliant. It would be my first tick in favour of this new model. The second is that the funding follows the outcomes. So often I ask officials and I ask myself, you know, how much money does it take to get that £1 into the pocket of the person for whom it was intended? And if it needs to go through multiple different agencies and levels, you know, you're spending £10 to get £1 into somebody's pocket to hopefully try and make a difference. Whereas when the funding follows the outcomes, you would hope to really reduce that and ensure that perhaps instead of £10 being spent on the process, you can actually put £10 in somebody's pocket, and that will be more effective. So that's the second thing, that funding follows the outcomes. My third reason for being interested in this is that it leverages in other funding. I am, as you said, about to set a budget, and there's never enough money to do everything we want to. You know, that goes without saying. This budget I'll be setting without the COVID consequentials we've had in previous years. That's not a political point, just as a fact. And yet the COVID impact on public services is still there. The recovery costs are there. And then business as usual is there. So it's a hugely, hugely challenging budget to set in an ever decreasing sort of public finance landscape. Again, it's not a political point, it's just a fact. And I think understanding how we leverage in other funding is really important in all of this. So that it's not a postcode lottery. So if you get 4 or 5 really good organisations, charitable organisations in one area who are working on a problem, but another area will have no interventions, which is nearly always the case in deprived communities. We all sort of centre into the easy areas rather than focus on the challenging areas. So leveraging other funding. And my last point, and why I think it's a model that's worthy of consideration, is that it localises the intervention. Any national blanket intervention will always fail to meet the nuanced circumstances of our local communities. So dealing with poverty in Staffin in the north of Skye is fundamentally different from dealing with poverty in Perthshire, which is fundamentally different in dealing with it in Glasgow. So partnering with local organisations. So those would be my 4 sort of ticks in terms of why I think it does have the potential to be transformational. But I don't think it will be transformational unless we fundamentally change our political debate, our political discourse, and our relationship with the public sector. Because this requires you to stop doing things that don't work. And I don't mind how many times we have a debate on a panel like this that says, no, it's quite right that we stop doing things that work. I guarantee you that if I stop doing things that don't work in a budget or in a political arena, we instantly get criticised for it. And, you know, every politician generally tries to keep criticism at bay. But this would require us that if the funding only follows the outcome, if you don't deliver the outcome, there is no funding. That means an organisation, a charity, a third sector organisation may not be able to continue doing what they're doing. And we need to be realistic, I think, about that. But secondly, it also requires us to stop doing things in the public sector right now. So if we are going to do things differently, then that £1 billion of employability funding needs to go from what we're doing right now to new ways. That requires us to move things within a budget. And in order to free up funding to do things differently, because I'm not sitting on lots of excess funding where we can automatically just reinvest in something new without stopping doing other things. And the third area where it challenges our politics is on prevention. Again, I hear how important prevention is all the time, and I couldn't agree more. But if you take the health service, for example, we know that, let's say, active travel, so people being out and being active reduces pressure on the NHS. The minute I fund a new park and take money away from acute frontline health, there will be obviously understandable outrage. And so in all these areas, I think we just need a more mature conversation about the effectiveness of Scottish public services right now, and the fact that if we truly want to do things differently in order to get different outcomes, we need to be willing to do difficult things. And that's, you know, a responsibility on my shoulders to stop doing things that I want to keep doing because it'll be painful. There's an obligation on the opposition as to what they scrutinise. And there's an obligation, I think, on the general public to understand what we're trying to do and how to do it. So I'll stop there, Chris, because I've probably talked at length. I want to see effective public services. I want to see sustainable finances. I think this is a model that could do it, but we also need to be honest about what it will take to get more effective public services. And it's not without challenge and ultimately turning theory into practice is, I think, the next test for this model.
Interestingly, Kate, I suppose thinking about what Jill was saying, she had the freedom in the Living Balance project to focus in the way that she thought would be effective. I'm presuming if there were bits that weren't working, she could tweak them as she went along. What she didn't have was the man from St Andrew's House, or the woman from St Andrew's House, not the minister, but maybe the civil service, over her shoulder saying, well, we've told you this is what we want. It's our money that's at risk here, so we expect you to do it that way. And, you know, it's proven quite hard for governments to give up the control on any kind of public service, really, and allow practitioners the real freedom to deliver, to change as they go, innovate on the spot, and actually say, you know what, as long as the outcomes are right, it's up to you how you do it. That's quite a big psychological shift for central government to do when it's spending public money.
Absolutely. And we need to be willing to contemplate failure. I don't like introducing that concept because we're talking about success here. Yeah. Jill is talking about success. But for every, let's say, 10 fabulous exemplars, there may be one that doesn't work. And nearly always that one that doesn't work colors everything. And so we get overly protective about making sure that all the forms are filled in, all the assessments are done, rather than just empowering and freeing people up.
Yeah, okay. Murdo, I suppose Kate has laid down a challenge to you there, which is were she to take this on the nose and attempt to shift money around, that the opposition wouldn't beat her up for it for the sake of it. Can you give that commitment today?
Well, first of all, Chris, thanks for having me. I'm sorry I missed the start of the discussion because I was on another call, and of course, as you know, I would never beat up Kate for any particular reason, least of all this. Maybe I can just give a few observations and then perhaps respond to some of the points. First of all, I've been made aware of this issue through Ian and Jill in Perth over many years. I hate to think how long ago, Ian, it was you first explained this model to me, but it's been a slow burn in terms of getting it up the agenda. But you know, we know it does work, and we've seen that work, you know, on the ground. And I mean, I came in earlier as part of the conversation around the issue, you know, the Christie Commission and why that's not been delivered, and there's lots of reasons for that. And I think Kate encapsulates quite well, you know, the pressures there always are on budgets, how no matter how much you might like the concept of preventative spend, there's always more immediate demands on your budget where money needs to be spent now, and it's much harder to do that long-term spending plan. But what I've liked about the social investment model is that it, in effect, de-risks it from the point of view of the public sector, because you are paying only on successful outcomes. And that means if there is failure, then it's not the public sector that's having to pay for it. Ultimately, it's the investors who have to, you know, make that choice. And I think that's one of the great benefits of this model, alongside the fact that you are developing projects which of necessity are much closer to the people, rather than, you know, large government-led or agency-led initiatives. So we know the model does work. So the model is there. We know it has advantages. We know there are investors who want to support the model. So what's the blockage? It really just needs some willingness to make it actually happen. Kate made some interesting points. I mean, first of all, I mean, the point about, I think it's a fair point to say that if you were to develop this model, it would not apply equally in all parts of the country. And I think that's a fair point to make. And I think we probably just need to be grown up about that and say that just because we can't do everything everywhere doesn't mean to say we shouldn't be trying to do the right things in some places if they can deliver a benefit. In terms of choices about funding, I think the advantage of this model is that there is a timing question, because you're only paying out money from the public sector against successful outcomes. And successful outcomes of necessity will be probably several years down the road. So Kate doesn't need to stop spending today on the employability project she's got. She might need to divert money away from them 3 years down the road, but presumably we're dealing with the same group of people who are being helped by the employability fund. So if these people suddenly are no longer needing employability support because they're back in the workforce, taking that money and using it to repay the investors in social investment actually isn't depriving anyone of funding. So I think the way that the fact that you pay only on results and at the point where these have been delivered helps with the timing issue. And Kate was talking about we have to contemplate failure. I think that's right. I suppose the advantage of this model is if there is failure, it doesn't cost the public purse anything. It is the investors who are taking the risk of losing out. So from a government point of view, it is relatively speaking, low risk or even risk-free. And finally, the other great advantage of this is I think the fact that this is about outcomes. I think far too much of the political debate, and I agree with Kate on this, is about inputs. So we have lots of debates about how many teachers there are, how many nurses and doctors there are, how much money we're spending. In fact, what's really important is not that. What's really important is how many people are getting treated, how many people have healthy outcomes, how many kids are doing well in school, how many people who've been to prison are not reoffending when they come out. These are the things we should be measuring rather than inputs. And if we can get that shift, I would be very supportive of that.
Do you think, Murdo, that we're talking about this healthy potential market for investing in these projects, and we're also talking about the need to be willing to fail, which we as a think tank are fully behind, the ability to take risks, to take experiment, try things, learn from your mistakes. But realistically, if there is a rate of failure, would those investors be quite as keen in future to put their money into this stuff if they think actually there's a good chance there won't be a successful outcome here? It might not even be the money; it might just be the feeling that it's wasted.
Well, I think there's a two-part answer to that. The first part answer to that is that some of these investors will be, approaching this from a genuinely philanthropic approach. So to them, getting a return on their investment is less important to them. And I'm sure, Alistair and Ian will know examples of people, in that category who are wealthy individuals who are prepared to risk funds because they believe in this model. And, they will do their own due diligence on the projects that are being brought forward. So they will make that conscious choice themselves. But if you look at this approach in the round, and you're dealing not just with one or two projects, but potentially a whole packages of projects in different fields across the country, you would expect that even if there are some failures, overall, there would be demonstration of success. And therefore, your average wise investor would see this as being a way of getting some sort of reasonable return on the capital they put in much the same way as if you invest in the stock market. You accept there'll be some winners and some losers in your portfolio. And I think if this market was mature enough, then you would see the same pattern developing in terms of social investment.
Okay, thanks, Murdo. I'd like to just move on to the audience now. A few questions. Sally Wang, I wonder if you'd like to go first.
Thank you, Chris. I'm a PhD student doing a topic on social investment at Middlesex University. So I'd like to ask the panel's view on the effectiveness of the social investment tax relief at encouraging social investment amongst investors.
Okay.
Here's what I found.
Kate, is that something you maybe just want to give a thought on? And obviously no commitments, or I don't know if that's under your remit anyway, but what do you think of the idea of tax relief?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should use, I didn't quite catch all of it, the line wasn't great, it's probably my end, that using all resources at our disposal to incentivize this. Obviously, when it comes to tax, one of the biggest challenges we have is on business or organization tax. We have access to income tax, which could perhaps be considered, but we don't have powers over incentives when it comes to income tax or so on. So what we really have when it comes to incentives are non-domestic rates, which won't always work for organisations. So there's definitely merit in exploring how we incentivise and make this easier. I think before we get there, though, is actually getting a model that works. Because my impression is that investors are interested in doing this if they can see the outcomes are being delivered. And delivering the right outcome is almost the biggest incentive than anything else. But Chris, come back to me if I didn't catch the full question.
Yeah, no, I think you've probably covered it as much as you can, actually. Nick Koonsberg, you have a point you'd like to make? Are you with us, Nick?
I think you might be on mute.
Oh, you're on mute, Nick.
Thanks very much, Chris. I'd like to make a couple of points which link up Kate's recent comments, but also cover an area which hasn't been identified in the discussion so far. First of all, tax relief is important, and I'm sure Alistair will want to tell us all about what was done with tax relief, both under social interest tax relief and under EIS and SEIS. It's been a very significant component in the development of an area which we haven't talked about, which is the extension of social enterprise into private enterprise. And I think in Social Investment Scotland, which I had the privilege of being involved with for 6 years, we actually developed the whole waterfront from the purest form of social enterprise right through in the direction of private enterprise. And it was interesting to see Angus Tulloch's comment trying to balance the concept of financial incentives with other incentives. And I think the educational impact of what SIS has done in the past 3 or 4 years has actually been very significant, because it is possible both to have a business model which makes money, but which will also make significant contributions, whether it's to the environment, whether it's to the local community. If anybody wants to look at the SIS annual report, they will see an incredible analysis of the various investments that have been made, covering everything from community, heritage, religion, through to renewables, reforestation, and indeed the development of new products. And the formation of the SIS Ventures Investment Fund is indeed at the forefront of a whole series of very interesting, innovative products, but where the founders are totally conscious of their social obligations, and where the investors are very happy to align themselves with those. I'll leave it at that. I'm sure Alistair might like to add to that.
Yeah, I think, Alistair, just following on from the previous question about incentives, and what would your response be to that? Because I guess that's exactly the area you're working in, investors.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks, Nick, for promoting SIS. As ever, we're grateful to you for doing that. So social investment tax relief is one of the mechanisms that has been introduced at a UK government level to encourage and stimulate the growth of the social investment marketplace UK-wide. SIS is the only organisation in Scotland to have used SITR, as it's abbreviated to raise funds from investors, and we've done that a couple of times. The relief is actually under review at the moment. It's actually under threat. It was developed very much as a what I understand to be a copy and paste of the EIS relief, and it hasn't very neatly aligned with the needs and the structures of charities and social enterprises on a UK-wide basis. The point Nick makes is right, though. There are ways in which private capital can be stimulated to make investments that are impactful. CIS Ventures, which is a subsidiary of CIS, makes investments in more traditional corporate structures, but corporate structures which do have a social purpose, and a social purpose which is locked in when we make an investment from CIS, to make sure that mission remains front and centre in terms of the business objectives of the organisation. So it's one of the ways in which government can encourage private sector investment into this space. There are others, such as match funding and guarantee funding, which perhaps might be more straightforward and more within the gift of the Scottish Government. My own personal opinion that for the model specifically that we're talking about here, you might not always need tax relief. It's perhaps another level of complication that isn't necessarily required to attract an investment, such as what you've heard about today. I think there are individuals that would be interested in making an investment that was perhaps more motivated by philanthropic objectives, but it's certainly one of a number of things that's worth thinking about and exploring as this overall market matures.
Well, Kate, we've only got a couple of minutes left. I suppose my question to you would be, you seem to be showing willingness to consider this model as something that can be explored further. What should people working in the social investment sector be doing now to take it from your level of interest to actually getting the Scottish Government engaged in specific projects? What are the steps from here to there?
Great question. So I know that Ian in particular has been engaging with Scottish Government officials, but I suppose my concern is that, and this is not targeted at Ian, this is me talking to myself and those on the call, is going from the theory to the model. So it's all very interesting discussion, but it really needs to get into a model, a pilot, the practical implication. And that's where I would like to see progress being made. I think it's possible to make that progress. I think we'll need to make some adaptations, as you would expect with any model. Let's try it out. We might not get it right the first time, but let's try something. And then hopefully that gives social investors, as it were, the confidence that we're serious. And if it works, then we could roll it out further. I think it's really important that we understand what social investors need in terms of reassurance, in terms of certainty, in terms of future plans. So I think there is a piece of work for us to take away, but I see on the call, probably today, we have everybody we need. There's key Scottish Government officials, there's obviously the panellists, and I see that there's social investors as well.
Okay, well, that brings us rather neatly to the end. What a great audience today, and also what a wonderful panel. Thank you to Jill Mcgrath, Ian Marr, Alistair Davis, Kate Forbes and Murdo Fraser for giving us their time. It's really appreciated. We at Reform Scotland certainly think this is a fascinating area and would like to see it explored further and would like to see progress on it. So I do hope, Kate, that is something that you know, over time that we will be able to see some progress on, and best of luck to everyone involved in the sector. So thank you very much again. Good luck with your budget, Kate. Good luck with opposing it, Murdo, and we shall see you all soon.
Thanks all.